Hello, and welcome to Obscure History. Here we are on the 10th episode of this series covering the Seleucid dynasty, and what a journey it has been so far. Last time we covered the unsteady reign of the boy king Antiochus V Eupator, along with his unfortunate regent Lysias. Both were executed on the orders of Demetrius I, the true Basileus and grandson of Antiochus III the Great, sweeping aside all immediate opposition with ease. The murder of another child king was just a drop in the ocean for Demetrius, for he now gained control of his birthright after 16 years of Roman confinement. As we'll soon see, however, the empire was still plagued with the same problems that had threatened the previous regime. Problems that Demetrius now inherited and would need to take care of in order to survive his first few years in power. With his daring escape from Italy now completed, let us go through Demetrius's time as king together. Demetrius's rise had been swift once he arrived at the capital of Antioch. There, the Syrians and the Greco-Macedonians were quick to hail him as the legitimate ruler of the empire, with many perhaps being reminded of the stability afforded under his father, Seleucus IV. His rule would have been still fresh in the minds of many, and perhaps that king's good deeds lent some weight in supporting the new arrival. Whilst Antioch and the immediate regions submitted to his will with lightning speed, Demetrius must have known it would take much longer for the other parts of the realm to follow suit. This seems like a good chance for us to take stock on the situation that the new king was faced with. As already alluded to, he would face much of the same issues that had plagued Lysias and his government. To the south, the rebellion in Judea was still very much active, despite the previous success at the Battle of Beth Zachariah, with Judas Maccabeus, together with his brothers, still at large. Even though he had physically freed himself from them, Rome's lingering influence would continue to haunt Demetrius, especially given the way he departed from his comfortable confinement. The senatorial delegation, headed by Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, waited anxiously in Asia Minor to see how Demetrius would act. They would surely report any worries back to the Senate, so the new king had to remain vigilant. Also in the area, the kingdom of Pergamon had developed uncharacteristically friendly relations with the Seleucids under Antiochus IV. This relationship would change now that Demetrius was in command, and not for the better, as we'll see later on. To the immediate north of Syria, Cappadocia was also not aligned with Demetrius's interests. King Ariarathes V was still rightfully unhappy that his wife and child had been quietly disposed of, even though this was done on the orders of the previous regime controlled by Lysias. Demetrius had attempted to smooth over relations by offering his sister to the Cappadocian monarch, but this was firmly rejected, and probably to the surprise and the annoyance of Demetrius. The two royal houses had past ties through the marriage of Demetrius's aunt Antiochus and Ariarathes IV, so Demetrius can be forgiven for assuming that another marriage alliance could have taken place. Ariarathes took this decision on the instigation of Rome, and the envoys he'd sent to Italy returned with congratulations from the Senate for rejecting the offer, gifting him a scepter and an ivory chair. Demetrius's decision to attempt the alliance made strategic sense, as it could have given him some influence within Asia Minor, the same influence that Rome wanted to deny him. The Seleucid Basileus will remember this slight against him. In the east, the satrap of Media, Timarchus, was still acting independently from central control, and would be an even graver threat than before, now that the son of his original benefactor had been murdered. Timarchus had no personal connections to Demetrius' father or himself, so this would naturally lead to resentment and no loyalty to the latter. Further east was the ever-growing threat of Parthia, who were becoming less of an annoyance and more of a real existential threat with each passing year. Their recently anointed king, Mithridates I, adopted aggressive policies towards his neighbours. This aggression was turned against the Greco-Bactrian kingdom under the king Eucratides I during this time. For now, they were busying themselves on their eastern borders, but if successful, then the Parthian horse could well be turned westwards once more against the Seleucids. The only external power somewhat favourable to Demetrius was surprisingly Egypt under Ptolemy VI Philometor. This is somewhat ironic given the infamous Syrian wars that led to the Seleucids and Ptolemies to fight over the region of Collier, Syria. The 80-year conflict was soundly resolved in favour of the Seleucids by Antiochus III when he officially annexed the regions of Phoenicia, Palestine and Judea, along with several other minor regions, into the Seleucid fold. For good measure, Antiochus IV instigated the Sixth Syrian War, which saw Seleucid armies march into Egypt itself for the first time, as they took to the offensive. Ptolemy VI was present in our narrative before, as he was the young king in charge of Egypt, along with his sister wife Cleopatra II and their brother Ptolemy VIII Physcon. Following the war with Antiochus IV, the two Ptolemies had ample reason to distrust one another. By 164, Ptolemy VIII managed to oust his brother from power, and the elder Ptolemy travelled to Rome to seek a personal audience with the Senate to settle the dispute between the two. Polybius relates that it was on the road to Rome where Ptolemy VI met with the then captive Demetrius, where the two exchanged pleasantries and seemed to have struck friendly relations. By 163 BC, Ptolemy VI returned to Egypt after the Alexandrians had rioted against Ptolemy VIII. The elder Ptolemy allowed the younger to govern Cyrenaica as a co-semi-independent ruler. For now, Demetrius could reasonably assume that there would be no hostilities from Ptolemy VI, owing to their prior friendship and the recent civil unrest. But as John D. Granger stated in his work, The Fall of the Seleucid Empire, quote, "Neither king would allow that to stand in the way of action should his kingdom require it." Moving to internal affairs, Demetrius had to strike a very fine balance. This would have been the time to reward those that had followed him into his exile with prominent positions in his government. The three sons of Apollonius, the former governor of Collier, Syria under Seleucus IV, were all given such rewards and would continue to serve Demetrius in high offices. On the flip side of the drachma were those officials who had been placed by Antiochus IV and had been reaffirmed by Lysias. He must have known that the pool of individuals available for such offices would have been somewhat limited, so it would make sense to keep some of these in their place to create as smooth a transition as possible. We know of some officials who opposed the very idea of Demetrius taking charge. Timarchus and his brother, the ex-finance minister Heraclides, being very obvious ones, which shows that the split in the royal family had now begun to trickle down the social ladder. All of these points made up the environment that Demetrius now had to contend with by the end of 162 BC. On a more personal note, Demetrius found himself in the position of bachelor. A queen of noble descent would ensure the proliferation of the Seleucid royal line and bring the empire one step closer to a secured future. There was a slight hitch, however. At the time of Demetrius's rise to power, there were not many available ladies in waiting that would have been of the right social standing. Cleopatra II was already married to her sibling Ptolemy VI, who would never allow a Seleucid to marry into their family again, despite being on somewhat friendly terms. The Antigonids of Macedon would have been a natural choice, but their line was now essentially snuffed out by Rome. Demetrius would sooner see pigs fly than being wedded into the Attalid dynasty of Pergamon, and none of the other players in Asia Minor would be willing or able to fulfill Demetrius's love life void. There was seemingly only one other path left open for the young king, and you can probably guess where this is heading if you haven't already. If you'll recast your minds back a few episodes, we went over the events that led to a soft revival of the Antigonid-Seleucid alliance in 178 BC, where Seleucus IV married his daughter Laodice to King Perseus. Following the abolition of the Macedonian kingdom by Rome in 168, Perseus and his children were taken to Italy, but Laodice appears to have escaped this fate. For the rest of the 160s, she seems to have moved back to Syria through the tenures of Antiochus IV and V. Many believe that it's probably this Laodice who married Demetrius, making for another sibling union within the Seleucid household. We know Demetrius's wife was named Laodice due to the discovery of some remarkable and rare coins, such as this one on screen. Most historians point to this evidence within numismatics as proof of the union, and I for one also believe it to be more than coincidental. As we've already seen, Ariarathes V had rejected a union with Laodice, so she would have still been available in Antioch at the time. Another clue can deduce Laodice's identity as Demetrius's sister by looking at the children the couple would eventually go on to sire. Demetrius, Antiochus, and Antigonus, the last being a clear reference to the final dynasty of Macedon. To be fair on Demetrius, his options were rather limited, and there was already a precedence of sibling marriage within the Seleucid family, with the marriage of Laodice IV to all of her brothers being an example. This included Demetrius's own father, so the taboo would have been lessened considerably by this point, at least to the ancients. By doing this, Demetrius could be further assured that his children's lineage were above board, and at least one of them would stand a great chance of inheriting the throne. Of course, this was also done strategically to secure an available Seleucid princess and a former sovereign in her own right. Demetrius didn't have to ponder long to decide his first course of action. Realizing that he needed to prove his worth to the wider empire at large, he concluded that the Judean rebellion would be the easiest matter to deal with. He knew that the quickest way of securing his newly won position on the Seleucid throne was to score an early victory militarily, thus proving to all that he was the one in charge. Assuming a mixed column of infantry and cavalry marched 20 miles a day, with their journey starting from Antioch, said force could arrive at the walls of Jerusalem itself within only 15 days, give or take. Once there, they would be fighting against a lightly armoured opponent that had shattered before. The Seleucids simply needed a clear strategy and the determination to fully see it through once and for all. Demetrius was soon confronted by a delegation of Hellenized Jews, with their leader Alkimos no doubt cozying up to the new king in order to get in his good graces. Maccabees 1 relates that Alkimos' visit to Antioch was primarily to receive the new king's backing as the new high priest, after the position had been purposely left vacant by Lysias in 163 BC. As a Hellenizer, Alkimos was everything that the Maccabees stood against, much like Menelaus, with the author of Maccabees 1 describing the man as, quote, lawless and ungodly. It made perfect sense for the two to ally against the common foe. So, seeing no reason to deny the request, Demetrius gave the new arrival his full backing, and declared that he would now fill the empty post of High Priest of Jerusalem. Also like Menelaus before him, Alkimos was not part of the main Oneid line, who had held the high priesthood for many generations before. But he did trace his lineage to the biblical Aaron, who was the brother of Moses. This fact probably helped Alkimos to convince Demetrius he should be in charge of Judean affairs. And the probable promise of financial incentives definitely wouldn't hurt the king either. Demetrius appointed one of his philoi, Bacchides, to the position of strategos to the army that would be sent south. Sources regarding the career progressions of Hellenistic aristocrats are typically very sparse, but we can say with a degree of confidence that Bacchides joined Demetrius in his escape from Rome, and not an official left over from the previous regime. An important task such as this needed to be entrusted to someone whose loyalty was beyond reproach. The normally hostile author of Maccabees 1 even admits his good character as, quote, a great man in the kingdom, and was faithful to the king. The true size of the force commanded by Bacchides has been lost to us, but it's a reasonable assumption to suggest an army of no fewer than 20,000 troops of good quality. Together with Alkimos, the strategos departed Syria with the army and arrived in Jerusalem in good order. The Maccabees seem to have done their usual tactic of fleeing into the nearby hills, and Alkimos was successfully installed in the high priesthood. It's probable that the Maccabees still required time to rebuild their depleted numbers, following the Battle of Beth Zachariah only a few short years before. Negotiations soon took place between Bacchides, Alkimos, and a group referred to as the Hazadeans, whose identity have been much debated over. They were either a minor separate group with their own variations in beliefs, or the name Hazadeans could be a blanket term used to describe the faithful. The negotiations were mostly a success, but some of the more conservative Hazadeans admitted to not being able to accept the authority of Alkimos. This was as good as any declaration of treason, and the new high priest promptly arrested and executed 60 men in total. From the point of view of Bacchides, these people were not much different to the Maccabees in attitudes, and they were going against royal decree, so their lives were forfeited. Whilst not a great look to start off with, the evidence from Maccabees 1 does suggest that Alkimos enjoyed a wider support base from the populace. With the approval of Demetrius, Alkimos was willing to further reappeal some of the stricter decrees of Antiochus IV, so this would have appeased the more moderate Hellenizers amongst the Jews in order to bring them back on board with the Seleucids. At least he enjoyed more popularity than Menelaus, who wanted to Hellenize Judea too rapidly. Bacchides next took the army and set up camp near a place called Beth-Zeth, where he arrested and executed some more locals. The Strategos was able to eliminate some of the Maccabean rebels, but evidently could not capture the ringleaders. We know from before that the Maccabees were no strangers to hit-and-run tactics, and it would make sense for Judas to take this approach if he was still gathering his strength of arms. I also take the reluctance for an all-out engagement as evidence of the higher quality army that Bacchides had at his disposal. Perhaps under the impression the Maccabees had been defeated, or possibly being recalled due to developments elsewhere, he left Alkimos in Jerusalem and returned to Antioch by the middle of 161 BC. Of course, we know with hindsight that the Maccabean leadership was still at large, and so the unrest between the Hellenizers and traditionalists would unsurprisingly continue following the departure of Bacchides. Judas and his band were still active against the smaller villages in the countryside, threatening Greek and non-Greeks alike. Unable to take this much longer, Alkimos soon sent another plea for help to the court of Demetrius, who was by now dealing with the deteriorating situation in the east of the empire. Back in Antioch, shocking news began trickling into the capital as events in the eastern parts of the empire took a disturbing turn. For the first time since acting independently, the former Seleucid satrap of Media, Timarchus, had managed to extend his sphere of influence past the natural border of the Zagros Mountains. He had taken over the city of Babylon in Babylonia by January of 161 BC, as his name is mentioned within a series of chronographic texts known as the Babylonian Kings List. Starting with the first dynasty known as the Amorites, the Seleucids are recorded as the 13th dynasty, with Timarchus making it on the list despite not being part of the dynasty. Rare bronze coins showing the usurper's portrait and name have also been discovered to have been minted at Babylon during this time. Following Babylon, Seleucia on the Tigris also fell after some initial resistance from the governor, who now fled. As already covered, Timarchus had been acting more and more on his own accord, distancing himself from central Seleucid authority since the death of Antiochus IV in 164 BC. The immediate aftermath of Lysias's paralysed regency fell very much in Timarchus's favour, for he became the de facto ruler over much of the eastern satrapies. The accession of Demetrius I in 162 was what probably drove Timarchus to finally declare himself not just king, but a great king, Basileus Magas. Heraclides also had no loyalty to Demetrius. This meant he could not work within the government and so had to go into exile, becoming a staunch supporter of Timarchus. Diodorus Siculus, writing about a century afterwards, relates how Timarchus wanted to completely awe the Roman Senate into supporting his claim to the kingship and a formal alliance. He sent the now former finance minister with large sums of wealth in hopes to bribe those senators who found themselves in weak financial situations. The previous post held by Heraclides would have granted him easy access to the royal treasury, and one wonders if part of the wealth used for bribing the senators came from Demetrius's own back pocket. The Romans responded by recognizing Timarchus's claim as king, in direct opposition to Demetrius. But given the distance and perhaps the willingness, Rome could not provide any material support. Demetrius knew that to allow Babylonia to fall was seriously damaging for his image and that of his families. Babylon itself had been the starting point of Seleucid rule for Seleucus I, and Seleucia on the Tigris was one of the largest Greek cities in the east. Perhaps this was the reason why Bacchides had been recalled, as Demetrius needed more of the royal army ready to move out east after realizing this threat needed dealing with post-haste. The second plea from Alkimos probably reached the king just as he was setting off for the east. He responded by sending another general named Nicanor along with a smaller contingent to see off the rebels, and was assigned as governor of Judea. Nicanor had been a man of Antiochus IV, who was one of the generals sent out against the Maccabees in 165 BC. If you'll recall, he was the one who calculated he could raise a further 2,000 talents of silver by capturing and selling Jews, regardless of their leanings towards Hellenizing. He then proceeded to lose against the rebels at the Battle of Emmaus, which was covered in the last episode. But losing and surviving to tell the tale can be better than no experience at all, I guess, which is probably why Nicanor was the pick. Upon his arrival in Judea, Nicanor and part of the Maccabees, led by Simon Thassi, a brother of Judas, engaged in a skirmish at a place called Dessau, according to Maccabees 2. It seems the Seleucids won the engagement, but Simon evidently managed to evade capture. Buoyed by the success, Nicanor sought to attempt negotiations with Judas directly. The author of the Maccabees text then relates an odd passage involving Judas being enlisted as a philos of the king, as well as marrying and settling down. John D. Granger remarks that this episode was designed to cast blame for the eventual breakdown of the talks on everyone but the Maccabees themselves. Any agreement made between Nicanor and Judas was never going to be accepted by Alkimos, and using these grounds, Demetrius refused to ratify whatever agreement was made. The fighting soon restarted, with another skirmish fought at Kafar Salama, but Judas took the day. The remaining Seleucid troops retreated back to Jerusalem, where a frustrated Nicanor began making threats to the priests of the Second Temple, even going as far as to burn the place down if Judas was not handed over into his custody. The governor would receive reinforcements, but these were local levies from the surrounding regions. It seems highly unlikely that Demetrius was able to spare any further support given the conflict with Timarchus. Judas honed in on the less professional quality of the troops, as he was now willing to change pace and fight another pitched battle. The next engagement at the Battle of Edessa was by far the most decisive. Before the fight, Judas inspired his men by relating how he was visited by the prophet Jeremiah in a dream. Jeremiah presented a golden sword to Judas, giving the following instruction, quote, "Take this holy sword, a gift from God, with which you will strike down your adversaries." Surely this was a divine sign that assured the rebels of winning. And sure enough, with the seasoned experience of Judas at the helm, and with a sprinkle of divine intervention to top it all off, the Maccabees managed to thoroughly triumph over the Seleucid force. The fighting began with Judas using one of his favourite tactics by taking the head off the figurative serpent early on. Nicanor and his cavalry guard were some of the first casualties of the fighting, sending the rest of the army into a panic as they began their retreat to the nearest Seleucid-held fortress at Gazara. As with many ancient battles, most of the casualties were sustained during the panicked flight as the Maccabees successfully harried their adversary for quite some time. Nicanor's body was soon located amongst the carnage, and his head and right hand were chopped off. These were taken just outside of Jerusalem and put on proud display for the mortified Alkimos to witness. We know the Battle of Edessa was fought on March the 13th, as Jewish communities still continue to celebrate it as Nicanor's Day. Judas mainly won because he was able to capitalize on the lack of substantial Seleucid reinforcements. The makeup of Nicanor's army would have been similar in quality to previous ones that had been sent out under Apollonius and Seron some years prior. The main bulk of the royal army was now under the direction of Demetrius, who was by this point engaging with Timarchus. Whilst Nicanor was chasing the Maccabees around in the arid Judean countryside, Demetrius was fighting arguably the more important conflict. It's ironic then, given the lack of sources for the campaign against Timarchus when compared to the fight with the Maccabees. Timarchus made an alliance with King Artaxerxes of Armenia, who had no reason to be loyal to the Seleucid cause. But much like the Romans, there was no physical support given to the pretender. Coins minted by Timarchus originating from Nisibis have been identified, and Diodorus mentions in a rare statement that he reached as far as the Euphrates River, attempting to cross over near the fortress city of Seleucia Zeugma. Due to the sorry state of our primary sources, comparing the composition of the two armies is mostly down to speculation. We know that Demetrius could rely on the main royal army stationed in and around Syria, which would have consisted of many Greco-Macedonian settlers in the form of phalangetes, as well as a strong bodyguard unit in the form of the elite Agama cavalry and perhaps some cataphractoi. Timarchus, on the other hand, would have been perhaps more restricted in his recruitment options. As the former supreme governor of the East, he would have had access to excellent quality horsemen from Media and probably archers from Elymais and Persia. I find it likely that many of the Greco-Macedonian settlers throughout the occupied East would not have joined Timarchus in his grab for power. The governor of Caracini to the south of Babylonia, Hyspaosines, continued to remain loyal to the Seleucids, and seems to have resisted any attempts by Timarchus to coerce him into flipping sides. Ultimately, the force Timarchus commanded wouldn't have been too dissimilar to what Molon had access to 60 years before in his rebellion against Demetrius's grandfather Antiochus III. If I had to make an educated guess, I'd say that Demetrius allowed Timarchus to advance as much as he did in order to draw him into unfavourable terrain, most likely using the narrow choke points of the Euphrates to his advantage. That way, the horsemen under Timarchus could be largely negated, as the flat plain would be split by the Euphrates River. Timarchus may have still held an advantage in missile units, but the decisive fighting would take place between the infantry, as Timarchus would have needed to fight his way across the river and break the king's entrenched position. The quality of infantry must have proved the deciding factor, as by 160 BC, Demetrius crushed Timarchus's army. It is not known what happened to the rogue governor after the fight, only that he is never mentioned again, and so can only be presumed dead in battle or by execution afterwards. Demetrius had gained the early victory he had desperately needed to shore up his legitimacy and to instill confidence in those around him. Grateful for being delivered from the tyrant, the Babylonians bestowed the title of Soter, the Saviour, to the king. We know he accepted this as an issue of coins were minted showing his newly adopted title, and these would be minted for the rest of his reign throughout the now reunited empire. With the east now settled, Demetrius wasted no time in reappointing Bacchides to take charge of the situation in Judea, now that the royal army could be properly freed up. He had, of course, received news of the debacle of Nicanor's defeat, and the realization that the Maccabean problem was still prolific meant that he no longer wished to take any chances. By the time Demetrius had defeated Timarchus and had sent Bacchides on his way to quell the rebellion, the Maccabees had managed to overrun most of Judea apart from the Acra in Jerusalem. The rebel leader knew that whoever won in the north would eventually make their way south to deal with him, and so he attempted to start a dialogue with Rome, but nothing concrete ever came of this. John D. Granger makes a valid point here in that Rome was unusually prominent in the minds of all those involved in the extended Seleucid crisis following the death of Antiochus IV. But all the appeals made bore no real support, at least none that was worth mentioning in our sources. Timarchus was recognized as king, which was enough to keep him going, but military assistance was what he really needed. Likewise, the only way Rome could assist Judas in his appeal would have been direct military intervention, which was not forthcoming. Meanwhile, both Demetrius and Antiochus IV can be seen with a more indifferent attitude towards the Republic, due to having a more personal experience with the Senate. In simple terms then, the more an individual was familiar with the Roman way of doing things, the less it was feared. Only those far off thought it was worth appealing to. Going back to our narrative, Josephus in Book 12 of his work titled Jewish Antiquities, as well as Book 1 of Maccabees, which is the main source Josephus draws upon, recounts that Bacchides made camp at Arbela in the region of Galilee. Here he proceeded to besiege a group of people hiding in the nearby caves who were presumably sympathetic to the Maccabean cause. The captives were massacred, but this seems to have been part of the wider ground strategy of the Seleucid war effort, as it had the effect of drawing Judas out into the open. Both sources state Bacchides commanded an army of approximately 20,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, and I think there's no need to question these figures. The Maccabean force, on the other hand, is only said to have been either 1,000 to 3,000 men, reduced to only 800 after a number of them fled in terror upon seeing the Seleucid host. Modern historians are right to be suspicious of these given figures. How could Judas have possibly controlled nearly the entirety of Judea with only 3,000 people at the maximum? The actual number of rebels must have been much higher, with the author of Maccabees and Josephus significantly reducing their numbers in order to justify the Seleucid victory, which, by the way, is exactly what happened on the plateau fought near Elassa in 160 BC. The two forces faced each other for a few days before Bacchides made the first move by shifting his army forwards, making escape implausible for Judas. Any sign of retreat would draw the Seleucids right on his heels, and as we're fairly familiar with by now, the highest casualties are caused during the flight. The plateau ground was not the most even, but it did afford the Seleucid pikemen to still deploy in the centre of the line without much hindrance. The cavalry were positioned on both sides of the front line, with Bacchides taking up the right flank with his guard. The skirmishers, consisting of slingers and archers, also took up advantageous positions to get a good shot in. Bacchides instigated the battle by commanding his phalanx units on a slow, methodical march with their spears level towards their foes. With his back against the wall, Judas decided the only way he'd win in this situation was to go for his tried and successful tactic of killing the enemy commander early in the fight, in the hopes that the rest of the army would melt away. Judas moved out and charged towards the right flank of the opposing army to carry out his plan of swiftly engaging the Seleucid horsemen, but as it turned out, Bacchides had his own ace to play. Ordering his bodyguard to carefully retreat, the Seleucid general toyed with his prey perfectly, drawing Judas and his horsemen further away from the main lines. The rebel leader must have thought he was about to enact his most ambitious victory as of yet, when all of a sudden, the sound of more riders behind him spelled disaster for the hammer. Bacchides had ordered the Seleucid horsemen of the left flank to join him in catching the rebel leader in a pincer away from the main battle. Judas Maccabeus, who had been a menace to the Seleucid authorities for several years, had been slain along with all of his cavalry. The Maccabean infantry were being pushed back, but they continued to put up fierce resistance. That was until the news of Judas's death began spreading amongst their ranks. The men quickly turned and fled with the Seleucid horse pursuing the survivors, where many were cut down. The decisive victory at Elassa meant the Maccabean threat was unlikely to surface anytime soon, now that Judas had met his end. Bacchides went about establishing a tighter grasp on Judea, setting up strong garrisons in a series of forts and walled towns. Leadership of what was left of the Maccabees passed on to another of Judas's brothers, Jonathan Appius, who continued resisting against the Hellenizers in whatever way he could. Bacchides returned to Antioch late in 160 BC, basking in triumph, but the celebrations would prove somewhat bittersweet for the Strategos. Going into 159 BC, Alkimos died of unknown causes, and it would seem the high priesthood was not filled by anyone else for quite some time. Not long after the death of Alkimos, Jonathan was seen as enough of a nuisance for the leading Hellenists in Jerusalem to send another appeal to Demetrius, requesting that Bacchides return to the region. He did so, and during his third visit to Judea, he besieged Jonathan and his followers at a fortified place known as Beth Hogla. After several days, Jonathan contacted his rival, and the two actually agreed to peace involving an exchange of POWs. In exchange for Jonathan leaving Judea altogether and not causing too much trouble, Bacchides swore an oath never to take up arms against him. The Seleucid general left once more whilst Jonathan extracted himself to a place known as Makmesh on the east side of the River Jordan, where he would remain for several years in relative peace. Demetrius appeared to be content with this arrangement from what we know. As mentioned before, he evidently left the position of high priest vacant, as to appoint another would surely create opposition from somewhere. For the first time in nearly a decade then, there was no major fighting taking place in Judea, as the region was forced to submit as a militarized province of the empire once more. With the Judean revolt seemingly suppressed, and the downfall of Timarchus taking place, Demetrius had successfully survived his first years as Basileus. It was also around this time one of Demetrius's officers, a man by the name of Menochares, visited his sovereign at Antioch. Menochares had been in talks with the Roman Commission under Tiberius Gracchus, which at that point was not far away in Cappadocia, just north of the capital. This was done probably in part to try and gauge how the Romans felt about Demetrius's sudden departure from Italy, now that it had been a few years. The result of these talks was a favourable outcome from Gracchus, who seemed happy enough with Demetrius and his ascent to power. This wouldn't have been very difficult to extract from the delegation, given that Demetrius was now very comfortably sat on the throne, with all known opposition now crushed. Wanting to capitalize on this diplomatic success, the Basileus soon dispatched another delegation directly to Rome. Headed by Menocrates, Demetrius held high hopes that these talks would be far more fruitful than the numerous past failures at pleading his case to be freed from captivity, with further encouragement from himself and the good words put in by Gracchus, of course. When Menocrates entered the Senate House, he presented them with a golden laurel crown valued at 10,000 pieces of gold, and even better, the murderer of Gaius Octavius, Leptines, to hand him over into their custody. Polybius relates that upon Demetrius's ascent to the throne, Leptines approached the new king to have mercy on him for the murder of the Roman senator and former consul. Stating that he alone was the sole perpetrator of the assassination, he told Demetrius to spare the other inhabitants of Laodicea, where the crime took place. Polybius paints Leptines with a very forthcoming attitude, as he apparently stated, quote, "For I myself will go to Rome and convince the Senate that I did the deed by the will of the gods." By the time he arrived in Rome, after willingly accompanying Menocrates on his journey, he still maintained his original attitude and eagerly went before the Senate to profess his crime. For one reason or another, he was certain the Romans would not treat him harshly, and somehow he actually proved to be correct. Polybius states that the Senate believed the murder to have been avenged by some other fashion, with no real reason given, and that the response was simply that they would treat Demetrius kindly, providing his reign met their satisfaction. Various historians have attempted to explain what happened during this incident, and it seems that Leptines was being let go scot-free for the murder of a fellow senator and former consul. It's possible Polybius has left out some key details, in which case the story is not one that's fully complete given the missing context behind the decision, a decision the Senate would hardly have made out of the goodness of their hearts. One plausible theory put forward by Professor Chris Seaman is that the Senate wished to save face by disavowing Octavius, as he ultimately signed off and supported Antiochus V's rule. That way, the Senate could more easily justify Demetrius as king, without it looking like they were continually changing their minds on the subject. But make no mistake, the Romans would always do what they felt was in their best interest as certain situations developed. The rise of Antiochus IV and his son afterwards benefited Rome during those days, and the vague promises made to Judas and to Marcus during Demetrius's own time continued to benefit them in creating an unstable situation throughout the Seleucid realm. They knew Demetrius was comfortably in control for now, but this wouldn't stop the Senate from making future moves that would help undermine him, as we'll see soon enough. With matters now dealt with in the south and east of his realm, Demetrius's attention was soon drawn to what was happening in Asia Minor. As we know, King Ariarathes V of Cappadocia had been fairly hostile towards the Seleucids since the execution of his wife and child under the regency of Antiochus V. This hostility was further continued with the rejection of Demetrius's sister in marriage. The Seleucid king decided now was the time to repay the earlier slight against him. Confident he was now in a strong position, the king sent an army directly into Cappadocia with orders to dethrone Ariarathes and replace him with his more compliant brother, Oraphernes. The operation turned out to be a success, and by 158 BC, Ariarathes had fled to Rome, and Oraphernes was installed at the behest of Demetrius as king of Cappadocia. There must have been contact between Oraphernes and Demetrius beforehand, with the former convincing a part of the Cappadocian nobility to back him as their candidate in exchange for certain concessions. For the first time since the Treaty of Apamea 30 years prior, a Seleucid army had crossed over into Asia Minor and forcibly bent an independent kingdom to the king's will. This clearly wasn't going to fly with the various powers throughout Asia Minor, not to mention the Romans, who had warned him previously of ruling in accordance with their interests in mind. It seems fitting, then, that a powerful ally of Rome and a usual long-time enemy of the Seleucids would champion the cause of Ariarathes V. The new king of Pergamon, Attalus II Philadelphus, had only been in power for about a year by this point, following the death of his brother in 159 BC. Attalus had to take over the kingdom as regent for his young nephew, the future Attalus III. Unlike the Seleucids, the uncles of the Attalid dynasty were not in the business of murdering their nephews, so we should consider the younger Attalus considerably lucky in that regard. Aged over 60 by the time of his ascension, we would be forgiven for assuming the older Attalus's time in power would be just a brief flicker, but he would actually live for another 21 years. Despite his old age, his mind was still as sharp as ever, and his plentiful experience in dealing with the Seleucids on prior occasions would prove invaluable to curbing Demetrius's ambitions. As a shrewd politician and a competent military commander, he helped his brother dutifully throughout the war with Antiochus III, and even partook in the Battle of Magnesia, which had of course taken the Seleucids down a few pegs. To see Demetrius meddling in affairs on the wrong side of the Taurus Mountains was troubling indeed to the new Pergamene king, but he had a plan already set in motion. Seeing that Oraphernes was placed in charge as Demetrius's creature, Attalus took notes and concocted a simple plan whose irony would be lost on no one. If Demetrius could easily place a pretender in charge of Cappadocia, then Attalus could also do the same on the Seleucid throne. His pick was a seemingly obscure man named Alexander. Ancient writers such as Josephus and Justin refer to him as Alexander Ballas in their respective source materials, which means something like Lord in Semitic. This could have been his name before assuming the regnal name Alexander, a possible hint at his true origins, but it could also just be an unofficial moniker. Diodorus tells us how Attalus came to find the young man. Quote, "Grieved at the expulsion of Ariarathes, and being eager for reasons of his own to check Demetrius, he sent for a certain youth, who in beauty of countenance and in age was exceedingly like Antiochus, the late king of Syria. This man resided in Smyrna, and stoutly affirmed that he was the son of King Antiochus, and because of the resemblance, he found many to believe him. On his arrival at Pergamon, the king tricked him out with a diadem and the other insignia proper to a king." Some ancient writers describe Alexander's claim of being a son of Antiochus IV as essentially laughable, with Diodorus claiming it to be outright false. Opinion on this, however, was clearly divided back in ancient times, as others such as Appian asserts he was an illegitimate child of the god manifested, by way of his mistress named Antiochus. Personally, I tend to believe this latter view to be more truthful. The fact that Polybius uses the term nothos, meaning bastard, to describe Alexander, but not necessarily an outright fraud, implies that many people did believe he was a son of Antiochus. We know Polybius was personally invested in Demetrius, so it's interesting he doesn't dispute the claim, as someone who should have a clear bias against him. For Attalus, even an illegitimate claim was good enough, so long as people were willing to go along with it, should it benefit them, and evidently, many people were inclined to believe the claim. The Nothos was escorted to the rugged mountains of Cilicia, where he was joined by a mountain chieftain named Xenophanes, who had taken to raiding the Cilician countryside after some sort of falling out with Demetrius. Back in Cappadocia, Orophanes was not doing too great with the golden opportunity handed to him. The kingdom seemed to be struggling financially at this time, and he was only able to pay Demetrius a fraction of what was promised. Resorting to desperate measures, the pretender began confiscating the wealth of many prominent individuals, and he even went as far as to sack a temple dedicated to Zeus in order to barely pay for his now mutinous troops. Worse still, Ariarathes had also returned to the region by 157 BC, after only a year in exile. Orophanes attempted to murder his brother on the way back whilst passing through Greece, but this ultimately failed. Ariarathes was soon summoned by Attalus, and from there received support in ousting Orophanes from Cappadocia, who now fled to the court of Demetrius in Syria. Also nearby, the former satrapy of Comagene, now ruled by Ptolemaeus, appears quiet in our sources since his semi-declaration of independence from the Seleucids in 163 BC. John D. Granger convincingly uses this silence in the sources to argue there must have been peace between Demetrius and the former governor, and potentially even cooperation. He pointed out the fact that if he was an enemy of Demetrius, then Ptolemaeus would surely have been mentioned during the campaign against Timarchus, as Comagene was only a short distance north from where Demetrius gained his early victory. It's possible Ptolemaeus even aided Demetrius to some capacity in his struggle, and it would have benefited the king to have a strong ally near the heartland of the empire, even if it was only nominal support. In Syria, the common people were becoming disenfranchised with Demetrius's rule already, as he appeared to not be as generous and approachable as prior kings. He had taken to periodically sequestering himself away from the public eye, where he spent much of his time studying Epicurean philosophy with Philonides of Laodicea, a prominent Epicurean philosopher and mathematician employed as part of the king's court. Meanwhile, Antiochus IV had been known for being a charismatic public figure who was always generous with his time and spending. So when people began hearing the propaganda machine of a supposed descendant of the deceased Antiochus attempting to claim the throne of his father, I too can see the appeal in wanting a change in who was in charge. So the situation to the north of Syria looks something like this. The Seleucids and the Attalids were essentially fighting a proxy war in order to gain influence throughout the region. The Attalids had their pretender Alexander under Xenophanes, who was able to launch devastating raids into the countryside of Cilicia, which in turn would have caused disruption to the economic centres of the satrapy. Ariarathes V was back on the throne of Cappadocia and now firmly within the anti-Demetrian camp, and Ptolemaeus of Commagene appears to have been allied with Demetrius and could launch counter-raids into Cappadocia. All this was happening whilst Demetrius himself had taken to neglecting his duties as king, at least from a military standpoint, which seems rather odd given his earlier assertiveness. As his rule lasted for most of the 150s BC, it was evidently apparent he was relying heavily on his officers to fend off the growing coalition against him. His general attitude by this time hints at him misreading the situation somewhat, perhaps not fully realizing how serious his list of enemies had become. And threats were also starting to creep in from the inside. By 155 BC, Oriphernes, who had been in Antioch since his expulsion from Cappadocia, clocked on to the general discontent aimed at Demetrius's rule. Justin reports that rather than informing his former benefactor who the most dissatisfied individuals were, Oriphernes took it upon himself to be the champion of their cause, citing that he had Seleucid royal blood in his veins through his maternal connection. The plot, whatever stage it was in, had still been uncovered and reported to the king, who acted swiftly to apprehend the traitor. Oriphernes was confined to house arrest in Seleucia at Piraeus to keep Ariarathes in fear of his potential comeback. Seeing this is the last mention of him in the historical record, we can be assured he faded into political irrelevancy, or was possibly a captive for only a brief time before being disposed of. The only person who stayed at least neutral towards Demetrius so far was Ptolemy VI of Egypt. For a while, the two nominal enemies had been able to live side by side in peace for a change. As mentioned prior, the relationship between the two monarchs would have helped to create a sense of coexistence between the two kingdoms. A more important reason, however, would have been the sorry state Egypt found itself in during this time. Ptolemy had been quite busy trying to reduce the influence of his brother, Ptolemy VIII Physcon, who had been causing plenty of trouble throughout the kingdom. After surviving an assassination plot in 154 BC, which he of course blamed his younger sibling, the elder Ptolemy managed to reduce his brother to the status of client ruler over Cyrenaica. He made his eldest son, predictably named Ptolemy, co-ruler later in the same year, but when this Ptolemy suddenly died only a few months later, this threw the succession into a wobble. Perhaps wanting to take advantage of this state of paralysis, Demetrius attempted to bribe Archaeus, the governor of Ptolemaic Cyprus, to switch allegiances to the Seleucids. The price of 500 talents convinced Archaeus that now was the time to abandon the Ptolemies, but the pharaohs soon found out of this attempted betrayal, and the governor soon hung himself rather than face the consequences. Once more, Ptolemy had also learnt that the money came from his supposed friend Demetrius. The plan seemed sound, but the endeavour only brought the enmity of a once potential ally, rather than the strategically placed island into his sphere of influence. Worse still, Demetrius may have been able to stave off the pretensions of Alexander up until this point, but the Nothos son of Antiochus IV would soon find new support from another backer. The former finance minister of that king, Heraclides, was still at large and had managed to escape his brother's demise. He had no love or loyalty to Demetrius, but following the death of Timarchus, Heraclides had been waiting patiently to pay Demetrius back in kind with his own downfall. Learning that Ptolemy was now hostile towards the king, Heraclides knew that now was the time to play his part in the rise of Alexander. Out of all the kings that now grew to despise Demetrius, it was Ptolemy who had the largest available army and navy, as well as finances to lend support to Alexander's cause. The only thing left to do was to obtain the blessing of Rome to ensure that they would not interfere with their plans. Linking up with Alexander, along with his sister and another supposed child of Antiochus and Antiochus named Laodice, Heraclides escorted the two to Rome, where the two youths managed to impress many within the Senate. The following is quoting Polybius on their visit there. Quote, "The young man spoke first in a reasonable manner, begging the Romans to remember their friendship and alliance with his father Antiochus, and entreating them, if they could, to help him to regain his kingdom, but if not, to allow his return and not to prevent those who were willing to assist him in winning back his father's throne." After him, Heraclides addressed them, delivering a long panegyric on Antiochus and accusing Demetrius, and finally maintaining that it was only just that they should allow the return of the young man and Laodice, who were the real children of King Antiochus. None of this pleased sober-minded members, who understood the artful construction of the ploy, and were frankly disgusted with Heraclides. But the majority, seduced by the charlatanry of Heraclides, were persuaded to draw up a consultum in these terms. Alexander and Laodice, the children of a king who was our ally and friend, came before the Senate and addressed it. The Senate, thereupon giving them the authority to go home to regain their father's throne, and it was decided to grant their request for help. Heraclides, now availing himself of this permission, at once began to hire mercenaries, and summoned to his aid a number of distinguished men. On arriving at Ephesus, he occupied himself with preparations for his enterprise. As the mentioned quote from Polybius suggests, and from what John D. Granger also points out, Rome was not willing to give any physical military support to Alexander, much like Timarchus and Judas had requested before. The last line about Heraclides preparing for his enterprise in Ephesus does strongly imply there was a gathering of forces from there, and probably from all over Greece, to help Alexander in his endeavour. It's quite possible that Rome had provided a financial boost in order to help pay for the said mercenary service, but admittedly this is pure speculation on my part. The main objective of the group was met in that Rome not only allowed them to leave Italy, but gave assurances that they wouldn't stop Alexander from toppling Demetrius, so this made it a very worthwhile journey. Soon, all the unfriendly relations Demetrius had cultivated over the years would come home to roost quite literally in the form of Alexander. But first, some of the finer details had to be ironed out. The plotters would need to continue gathering the army and a navy large enough to transport them. Once near enough to the border, they would have to gain access to the kingdom by means of subverting a governor to make said access as smooth as possible. The ideal situation would be to get most of the recruited army safely inside so they can fight the inevitable battle to topple the existing king. Figuring this all out and the prep going behind it all would explain why it took a few years before the invasion truly began. If John D. Granger is correct regarding the level of support that Ptolemy would lend, then this would also need time to assemble the necessary ships and manpower. But when it did happen, Demetrius would regret not making more allies. In 152 BC, the moment finally arrived once Alexander and his forces sailed into the harbour of Ptolemais Ache in Phoenicia, capturing it with ease. This would indicate that Alexander, or perhaps Heraclides, had been in contact with the governor of the region, who surrendered the important port city along with its sizable garrison. The Nothos must have had at least several thousand troops at his command, as these would have been more than enough to outclass the men Demetrius had stationed in the immediate area. This would help somewhat to explain the lack of any response from Demetrius, as his main base of power was further to the north in Syria. Another reason why Demetrius failed to move against his latest rival quickly enough seems to be tied to his growing unpopularity amongst the population of Syria, particularly from within Antioch itself. The king recently had to deal with Andriscus, a mercenary turned pretender to the now defunct Macedonian throne, who claimed to be a son of Perseus. What started as a joke between the man and his friends soon turned into actual support for the idea of a potential resurrection of the Macedonian kingdom with Andriscus at the helm. He even appealed to his supposed uncle directly to aid him in his scheme, but Demetrius could never consent to such a plot, for that would drag him directly into conflict with Rome. Instead, he had the man shipped away from Syria, but it seemed the people of Antioch were rather sympathetic to Andriscus and thought he had been mistreated. Rioting soon broke out in the capital, which Demetrius brutally suppressed. This incident alone shouldn't have made Demetrius so unpopular, but with the growing popularity of Alexander now at the head of an army, many people must have wondered if now was the time to jump ship. With his grasp on the capital rattled, he must have feared of another outbreak of mob violence once Alexander landed, and so troops must have been tied down around Syria in order to keep control of the situation there. The main arguments used by John D. Granger to support the idea of Ptolemaic intervention are definitely worth considering at this time. Firstly, one of the first threats Alexander would have faced would have been the Seleucid fleet intercepting them before landing. The only naval power who could have rivaled this would have been Ptolemy, whose warships would have been more than enough to dissuade the Seleucid fleet from opposing Alexander's landing. Second would have been the necessary funds to support the host that Alexander now had command of, which would have been quite considerable, given the ultimate aim of it was to go up against the royal Seleucid army at some point. This by itself would have required substantial coin to upkeep, and like my suspicion with Rome chipping in to help to finance the expedition, I find myself agreeing with John D. Granger's suspicion of Ptolemaic financial aid, along with further subsidies from Attalus II. Another noteworthy point made was that it's possible the expedition was launched from Cyprus, and if correct, would have been very ironic given Demetrius's diplomatic slip-up over the island only a few years prior. No doubt Ptolemy kept a stronger force to hold down the island, following Seleucid interest in acquiring it, and any force stationed there would have formed a large part of Alexander's task force, especially the navy. Material support from Attalus would have arrived much quicker to Cyprus than anywhere else, given he had control over many strategic coastal settlements along the south coast of Asia Minor. The first coins found minted by Alexander at Ptolemais Achae have the Seleucid date 162 inscribed, which equates to between 151 to 150 BC. This has been used as evidence by Granger to suggest that Attalid and Ptolemaic backing was enough to last Alexander all of 152 BC, as he felt no need to begin production of his own coinage until almost a year after he had landed. As already mentioned, there was clearly no immediate fighting between the two, but Demetrius was beginning preparations to put down the upstart. Part of this was to recall large portions of the army that Bacchides had stationed around Judea to be deployed for the upcoming fight. The Maccabee books and Josephus of course spin this as a great retreat of the enemy, but some forces were left at Jerusalem's Acra and at Beth Zur. The recall also had the additional intent of placing quality troops under Demetrius's direct command and away from any temptation of being brought into Alexander's side. The withdrawal of so many Seleucid troops greatly benefited Jonathan Appius, who had now reappeared as a growing strongman in the area, despite the promises made to General Bacchides. In a strange, ironic twist of fate, however, Demetrius attempted to curry favour with Jonathan for once. It would appear the Seleucid king was growing rather desperate to win him over, for he allowed the rebel leader to recruit troops, equip them with arms, and for the release of hostages who had been held at the Acra. All of this clearly went against Demetrius's overall policy of minimal compromise when it came to dealing with the Maccabees, but there was some strategic insight to it. The only sensible reason Demetrius would even entertain the idea of an alliance with Jonathan was so that him and Alexander did not unite against him. There was probably very little in the way of high-quality weapons and armour left available for the Maccabees to utilize anyway, given most of this would have departed with the army. Anything left behind that could be used would be safely behind the Acra's walls. We have seen that even though the rebels had essentially overrun most of the region before, it could be swiftly retaken again, just as long as the Acra did not fall. For all the apparent privileges Demetrius bestowed onto Jonathan, he was basically giving him nothing they could just take for themselves anyway. At first, Jonathan accepted the offer from the king, taking up residence in Jerusalem, minus the Acra, of course, and the uneasy Seleucid garrison left there released the hostages as promised. Jonathan must have seen the mostly empty words behind Demetrius's offers, so for this reason, he excitedly went over the counter-offer that had come from Alexander. Maccabees 1 has this to say on the letter, accompanied by a purple robe and a golden crown. Quote, "King Alexander to his brother Jonathan, greetings. We have heard about you, that you are a mighty warrior, and worthy to be our friend. And so we have appointed you today to be the high priest of your nation, and are to be called the king's friend, and you are to take our side and keep friendship with us." It goes without saying that Jonathan and Alexander both had obvious reasons to form such a partnership. Jonathan would never be able to fully trust Demetrius, given that it was his regime that he and his brothers had been fighting against for over a decade by this point. Alexander obviously wanted to make his usurpation as smooth as possible, and part of this would have been wanting a pacified southern frontier. It's rather telling that Alexander didn't actually assist Jonathan with the Demetrian garrisons left in the area. For one, tackling these would bog him down in the wrong region when he needed to secure the heartland of Syria first and foremost. He also probably hoped these troops would switch their loyalties to him once Demetrius had been taken care of, and in doing so would continue to keep Jonathan at bay, so really they were useful to Alexander either way. Upon hearing of Jonathan and Alexander's union, Demetrius attempted to get him back on board with the promises of tax exemptions and even territorial expansion, but the new high priest rejected these firmly, aligning himself with the pretender. These further promises were clearly unrealistic to give, and it's possible the concessions were never even made in the first place. All this politicking can only account for one region, but it's useful to study in order to get a sense of how Demetrius and Alexander must have been vying for support from others across the whole empire and beyond. Come spring of 150 BC, Alexander was the first to make his move, confident in his numbers to begin the march northwards. He would have needed to storm and seize several key coastal settlements along his march, for these places could disrupt his lines of resupply. Cities such as Tyre, Sidon, Byrtos, and Byblos all housed significant fleets, and these were better in his hands and not in those of Demetrius's. The Nothos then took part of the fleet at his disposal, along with a portion of his army, and landed at Seleucia at Piraeus. Numismatic evidence of coins minted at all these places further corroborates their takeover at this time, as like with the coins of Ptolemaios Achae, the first date to appear is also between 151 to 150 BC. Our ancient sources record two separate battles taking place. The first engagement was a defeat for Alexander, who reportedly lost several thousand, but the pretender and a sizable portion managed to retreat in good order back to Seleucia. The second battle followed only a few days afterwards, and this proved to be the more decisive fight. It seems both Alexander and Demetrius had managed to acquire a limited amount of war elephants, which to my own surprise meant that Lysias was not the last Seleucid to utilize these. This must have meant Octavius hadn't hung strong all of them after all, or Demetrius managed to obtain more at a later date, with Alexander possibly taking over the militarized city of Apamea and appropriating those that were still there. Most of our available sources tend to gleam over the battle's events, but they all end with the same conclusion. Josephus gives us one of the more in-depth accounts of Demetrius's fate, giving the king surprisingly high praise despite his usual anti-Seleucid stance. Quote, "And in the battle which took place, the left wing of Demetrius put their adversaries to flight, and pursuing them for a great distance, killing a great many of them, and plundering their camp. But the right wing, where Demetrius happened to be, was defeated, and though all the others fled, Demetrius fought valiantly, and slew not a few of the enemy. But in pursuing the others, he rode his horse into a deep swamp from which it was difficult to get out, and as his horse fell just there, he was unable to escape and was slain." For the enemy, seeing what had happened to him, turned round, and encircling Demetrius, all threw their javelins at him. But though he was on foot, he valiantly fought them off, until finally, after receiving many wounds, and no longer being able to hold out, he fell. Such was the fate that overtook Demetrius. At aged 37, and after a reign of nearly 12 years, the grandson of Antiochus the Great had fallen whilst fighting another civil war. Now in his place sat Alexander I Ballas on the Seleucid throne. The reign of Demetrius I Soter sits at a critical turning point in Seleucid history, complex, promising, and ultimately tragic. On the whole, he proved himself more decisive than his immediate predecessors. Even before taking the throne, he showed the intelligence to maneuver through the politics of Rome, and he clearly possessed an ambition and drive that drove him to reclaim his homeland. He demonstrated ruthlessness when needed, such as in his swift elimination of Lysias and his young nephew Antiochus V. Once in power, his reign began with promise. He dealt with the rebellion of Timarchus in the east and largely pacified the Maccabean revolt. For a time, it seemed he might be the one to finally end the empire's internal instability and unite the house of Seleucus. However, as his reign progressed, public sentiment began to turn against him, largely due to his unapproachable character. The people of Antioch and Syria more broadly grew disillusioned with his regime. He was often described as stingy with public funds, and the impression given by our sources is that of a man who became increasingly reclusive, more interested in private pursuits than in ruling traditionally. And yet, multiple sources, even those hostile to the Seleucid cause, affirm that Demetrius died sword in hand, a testament that he was still willing, when it mattered most, to play the role of warrior king. Looking back through his youth as a hostage in Rome, we know he took pleasure in hunting wild game in the Italian foothills. Later in life, he reportedly studied Epicurean philosophy, which prioritized personal happiness and peace of mind above all else. Epicurus and his followers famously abandoned politics to avoid the frustrations it brings, but Demetrius was a king, and for him such frustrations were unavoidable. It's possible that a personal conflict emerged between his philosophical leanings and the hard realities of kingship. It's entirely possible that even though Demetrius was an adult when he came to power, he still lacked much of the necessary experience to rule an empire as large as the Seleucid realm. I see a young man who was quite probably having to learn much without a senior figurehead being present, and this would have done him no favours. Whilst his disinterest in day-to-day governance may have played a part, Demetrius remained active enough to confront Alexander Ballas in his invasion. His failure to move south may be explained by the need to keep garrisons posted across Syria, a necessity driven by growing unrest across his already fragile base of power. It's telling there are no recorded instances of Demetrius travelling to the eastern provinces, as his predecessors had done before. In fact, he appears to have rarely left Syria at all once he returned from Italy, a reflection perhaps of how precarious Seleucid kingship had become. Prior kings could campaign far and wide, confident in the support of the aristocracy and the people, their legitimacy secured through clear succession. By Demetrius's time, that had all changed. The throne had already seen two uncles kill their nephews to seize power, Demetrius himself among them. And now a pretender propped up by foreign powers could seize the Seleucid throne, unthinkable in earlier generations, but a sad symptom of the upheaval that had become the norm. In this sense, then, Demetrius was as much a product of the empire's decline as he was a contributor to it. I see him as someone who took control of the empire, rightfully so, and established himself effectively at first. But once the initial obstacles were cleared, idleness began to set in. Demetrius pursued personal pleasures, perhaps too earnestly, whilst others continued to play the Hellenistic Game of Thrones. There were of course moments when he roused himself, such as his intervention in Cappadocia, but he failed to secure any meaningful alliances to shift the balance in his favour there. Ptolemy VI could have been a viable partner, but Demetrius's half-hearted meddling in Cyprus soured any potential friendship. That mistake cost him dearly, but it wasn't the only one. My final question is this. Had Demetrius taken the threat of Alexander more seriously and acted earlier, could he have held things better together? Perhaps, but given what we know of his character, it's likely another pretender would have emerged eventually. That to me shows that Demetrius's reign was always destined for failure. He was a capable but doomed ruler who should have done himself more favours. He bore the title of Saviour, but that was not enough to save the empire. In the end, he unwillingly handed it over to an outsider, leaving the door open for further fragmentation, civil war, and the slow disintegration of Seleucid authority. An empire once mighty, now crushed beneath the weight of its own succession crises. As always, a big thanks to those who have made it to the end of the episode. And if you're new to the channel, then I extend a warm welcome to you. Next time in episode 11, we will see what Alexander I Ballas does with his usurped throne as the fallout of continuous civil wars sees more parts of the empire break away. If you've enjoyed what has been covered in this video, why not leave a like and a comment, or subscribe if you wish to see more. The sources used for this episode have been included in the video description as always. So until you hear the drums of war again, this has been Obscure History.